Welcome, everyone, to the Canadian Ecopsychology monthly virtual gathering. Hello, my name is Carol Koziel, and I'm the founder of this virtual group. Today, Alysha Jones will be speaking to us about unsettling ecopsychology. But first, a little bit about Alysha. 6 years ago, Alysha began her study of eco-depth and ecopsychology at Schumacher College in Devon, England. Alysha is a primary care nurse working for the First Nations Health Authority in remote northern communities in British Columbia, Canada. She is committed to a depth-oriented and critical social, anti-racist, anti-colonial, and anti-oppressive approach in both healthcare and ecopsychology practice. While not working in the North, Alysha is a guest and settler in the traditional territory of the Tsuk First Nation and the land of the cedar and sea, otter, fir, and flicker, the cultural ecological region of southern Vancouver Island, British Columbia. Thank you so much for squeezing us into your busy schedule, Alysha. I'm looking forward to this presentation, and the airwaves are yours.
Thank you, Carol. Thanks for that introduction, and thank you very much for inviting me to present on the Canadian Ecopsychology Network here with everyone. Good morning, depending on where you're located, or good in the middle of the night. In the case of the gal from Brisbane, thank you for joining us at such wee hours for you. So welcome, everyone. Today I am going to talk about some of the ideas that underlie this paper that I co-authored with my good friend, ecotherapist David Siegel. Unfortunately, he can't be here with us today. He's probably out on the seashore with his youth clients, or doing something equally fun in his work as an ecotherapist. But I hope that today I can represent our collaboration well. As well as the mentors and guides, and honor the work that they have shared with me and the people I've learned from. But of course, I have my own biases. I certainly do have biases based on my social identity as a settler person, as a white person, as a cisgendered, heterosexual, middle-class person. I have all of these biases based on my social location and this conditioning. The reason I mention this is because it informs and creates the way I see things and the things I don't see. I know I've been deeply conditioned in settler colonial culture, in white supremacist culture, and in an anthropocentric and anti-ecological culture. And that is why ecopsychology certainly has been medicine for me, remediating some of those pieces of an anti-ecological culture. So while I say I know those things, privilege means that I don't know what I don't know. So identifying myself in this way is to try and not necessarily forgive in any way the shortcomings or things I'm not seeing, but to acknowledge that they're going to be there, and open up space of safety for all of us, I hope, to be imperfect. I also want to say that I'm a daughter, I'm a nurse, I'm a partner, I'm a sister, an aunt, an ecopsychology, and a Buddhist practitioner. So I speak to you today from Tsuk territory on the shores of the Salish Sea. It's a beautiful, cool, rainy day here, which the land desperately needs. There's no doubt about it. So I'm thankful for that. I live in the town of Tsuk, which is an anglicized version of the Senchothan word for Tsuk. I live here as an uninvited person, as an uninvited second-generation settler of English, Irish, and unknown ancestry. My father was adopted. So the Tsuk traditional territory extends far beyond what is now called the Tsuk Mountain, the Tsuk Hills, all along the Tsuk Basin and the Tsuk River. And then the reserve land that the Tsuk Nation lives on now is only 67 hectares. So I'm locating myself in relation to the Tsuk Nation here as part of my sense of being a non-Indigenous settler person in this territory, with this acknowledgement, I am in any way not abdicating responsibility for ongoing settler colonialism here. I'm occupying this territory, and I have the privilege to do so at the expense to Suk people. I'm thinking of the word in Senchothin for settler, which I'll probably pronounce wrong, but is Hwanatum, and this means the hungry people. And so I acknowledge that I'm part of a group of people who are considered to really not be able to get enough and to consume and take. And that's a part of the culture I've been conditioned in. So recently there have been a few publications and blog posts and so on about making territorial acknowledgement in a more responsible and fuller way. And while I'm trying to do that right now, I really don't exactly know how to do that still. This is always an ongoing process, as is my unsettling. So I leave that sort of, I say that openly, but Hayden King, who's an Anishinaabe professor recently, had written, and I've seen writing and other posts by him, that he said, you know, there's a responsibility that comes from acknowledging this, and there's a being compelled to do something more about it. So perhaps we can talk about that in the discussion. But for me, that means becoming a better treaty partner and doing more to support Suk resurgence in this area in terms of food security and in terms of alternative energy projects that are happening here. So thank you for listening to that introduction. I know it's a lot, but I needed to name those things. And before I go on, I also just want to say that you know, when settler colonial studies started, which I think was in 2010, around that time, maybe even a little bit earlier, there was a lot of attention that gathered around settler colonial studies. And some authors, scholars based out of University of Victoria here have said, you know, all of the attention on settler colonialism and looking at it, and the centering of white settler people is really can detract or pull away from Indigenous voices and Indigenous resistance and resurgence. So I just want to name that paradox right now, that while I'm talking about being settler and unsettling ecopsychology, you know, I acknowledge that it is pulling away from Indigenous voices, and hope to center their voices to the extent that I can here. Okay, moving on. Thank you for your patience with that intro. So my intention today is to speak about unsettling ecopsychology, to open up a conversation about the ways in which ecopsychology may be a real part of our practice. Move on there, sorry, I forgot that one. How it is a real part of our practice here on Turtle Island. So this is the colonial context I speak from. How it's normalized within ecopsychology practice, and what we can do as folks committed to social and ecological justice, how we can contribute to the potentials of anti-colonial solidarity with Indigenous resurgence within our field of ecopsychology. Talking about settler colonialism for us white folks particularly is uncomfortable. It certainly can be uncomfortable, painful. There may be shame, fear, uncertainty, grief that come up. And certainly we need processes together to work through that. I think in this paper, we had written that ecopsychology may provide a particularly unique way for settler people to come together to talk about the psychological and emotional and social challenges of being settler people in colonized spaces doing this practice. So while acknowledging that, I also need to say that for Indigenous peoples, colonialism is lived every day and very personally, as is white supremacy for people of color and Indigenous people. Nikki Sanchez is a decolonial scholar here in the Coast Salish territory, and she says that for settlers, colonialism is not your fault, but decolonization absolutely is your responsibility. So in our paper and thinking, the emphasis has been on unsettling versus decolonization. And the reason for this is that Indigenous decolonization is Indigenous movement and involves Indigenous peoples' own strategies for liberation centered on their land and sovereignty. According to Dakota scholars Waziatowin and Michael Yellowbird, first and foremost, it must happen in the mind. And this is also called neurodecolonization. And Peggy has written a great article about decolonization, in which she includes neurodecolonization as part of that discussion. For scholars Eve Tuck and K.W. Yang, decolonization must include the return of land, reparations that include land, giving back of land, and the sovereignty of Indigenous nations over that land. So they've called it decolonization, not a metaphor. It's not something that is like another social justice project. It's not something that is comfortable at all. They call it has an ethic of incommensurability, meaning that there's no common measure for it. Decolonization has also been called the tangible unknown. So for myself as a settler person and perhaps others, this is it's decolonization is something with a lot of uncertainty and possibly sounds scary, as though settler people need to return to their ancestral territory or give back the land they now live on, or move, and certainly these ideas can come up. But from my reading of Indigenous scholars and listening to the voices of Indigenous people, this is most often not what I hear when decolonization is spoken about. Tayayage Alfred is a Mohawk professor here at Coast Salish Territory, and has written a number of books on Indigenous resurgence. And he says that decolonization, what's needed is not that settler people leave and return the land entirely, but that enough is given back for Indigenous people to again practice their own traditional culture in their own territories and have enough space to do that. So unsettling, which is the topic of the paper, and our focus there is when settler peoples turn a critical gaze upon themselves and settler colonial culture to investigate their role within a system that benefits them at the expense of Indigenous peoples. Here is a book written by Paulette Reagan, a settler woman who's the head of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. That is not exactly correct, but she had a very powerful role within the Truth and Reconciliation processes. And I'm not recalling right now what exactly her role was, aside from being up there. But she's written this book called Unsettling the Settler Within, which is a great resource for me. So unsettling is a learning process that makes space for Indigenous counter-narratives of settlement and sheds light on the settler narratives that are invisible to settler people and that perpetuate settler colonialism. Harsha Walia is a South Asian activist and scholar in Musqueam territory in Vancouver, and she notes that for settler people of color, living in the context of settler colonialism often means being both oppressed and complicit. So when I talk about settlers, I don't mean to flatten the differences between white settlers and settlers of color, because there's absolutely a difference in power and privilege. So it's really important to be naming that. Okay, so I'd like to briefly just share my own, some elements of my own unsettling process, which is absolutely informed in an ongoing way by my work and my living in Indigenous communities now as a nurse. But I'll just pop back to my experience practicing ecopsychology. So I've been studying and practicing ecopsychology here on Turtle Island in so-called British Columbia and in England for a number of years. And colonization, the reality of colonization and colonialism hadn't been something that was strongly in my mind in the context of ecopsychology practice. I had understood ecopsychology to be a Western product emerging from the radical ecology movement, inspired by system science and depth psychology, ecopoetics, ecofeminism from Buddhist and Taoist teachings, and also from Indigenous teachings. I was familiar with the emphasis that ecopsychologists had placed on not appropriating Indigenous cultural practices, and had heard that firsthand from ecopsychology practitioners. And I could also see the dissonance and the resonance that held. But it wasn't until I could see more clearly the colonial context of our practice that dissonance and resonance with Indigenous ways of knowing and being on the land became problematic. So in 2015, I went back to England, where I had attended Schumacher College, and to assist on an ecotherapy course there, and joined some rites of passage work. It was called by the guide there Land Time, but this work is also called Vision Fast or Wilderness Fast, Wilderness Vigil, and often is the form of a 4-day fast solo on the land. So it was the first day of my fast, and I'd found an area that really spoke to me, and my experience, it spoke to a deep part of me actually, and my experience practicing ecopsychology on ancestral territory, which England is partly for me, was quite different in quality than practicing ecopsychology in so-called Canada. And yet there I was on Dartmoor in southwest England, and this is an area that's largely deforested, certainly largely deforested of the native oak trees and the native oak forest, but I had come upon some western red cedar, which is a tree very much native to this part of the world and this ecology that I'm speaking from here. So encountering that tree, in that place, it provoked insight in me around, the practice that I was doing in ecopsychology in land that wasn't native necessarily to me, and land that was actually a colonized space. So practicing ecopsychology on ancestral territory brought up these insights. I realized that seeking to connect deeply with and belong to land that was colonized, wherein Indigenous peoples were not able to do the same necessarily in their very own territories, was really problematic and did not feel right. Thinking about and working with this idea of the ecological self and deep ecological belonging couldn't be had without a critical social dimension. And this connected with my appreciation and mentorship in the teachings of Andy Fisher, who speaks about both a recollective and a critical ecopsychology. It also connected with some of the readings I had done in ecopsychology by specifically Carl Anthony and also cellist Glendinning. As I learned more about settler colonialism, this has been a time now of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, of more and more exposure to the reality of the extent that what's been called the octopus arms of settler colonialism on Turtle Island, and how it's impacted and continues to impact Indigenous peoples. The murdered missing women and girls, the 60s scoop. I mean, these, colonial processes and policies just go on and on. So the more I learned about settler colonialism in this context, doing ecopsychology or land and nature connection work in the context of this injustice became more problematic. As we say in the paper, an ethical struggle, the ethical struggle of connecting therapeutically with the land while being in the midst of the biggest land theft in history. In my growing up, I grew up in Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe territory in Hamilton, Ontario, and I didn't have, and nor did my family have, direct relationships with Indigenous peoples. My sense of Indigenous peoples at that time was of this myth of disappearing, this myth of disappearing Indigenous people and the naturalized settler, the erasure of Indigenous people and assimilation of Indigenous people by the Canadian government were fully a part of my worldview. And so learning about settler colonialism as a structure as a process, and the way that it functions really started to open up my eyes, and I could see it everywhere. You know, the signs of settler society, the reality that Indigenous people are a radical minority in their own homelands, started to seem like something quite crazy. That it's possible that everywhere, the shops, the stores, the post office, the commercial and public institutions, and all of the extractivist industries and so on are designed for settler people, and that land has been taken for settler people, while again, this radical minority of Indigenous people. So settler colonialism, as I have been talking about there in that way, is a form of colonization in which outsiders come to land inhabited by Indigenous people and claim it as their own new home. Leanne Simpson, Anishinaabeg scholar, activist, scientist, she calls it a strangulation of Indigenous bodies, minds, and nations. It's a structure of racialized violence and superiority fundamentally, and it also hinges on a logic of anti-Blackness. It's meant the theft of people from their homelands in Africa to become property of settlers to labor on stolen land here on Turtle Island. So how does ecopsychology reproduce settler colonialism and how is settler colonialism normalized within ecopsychology practice? Firstly, ecopsychology reproduces settler colonialism by practitioners relating to the land as an unpeopled place without an Indigenous history or presence, as an essentialized, empty space, a wilderness that is there to be used for self-healing and transformation. Ecopsychology reproduces settler colonialism by not naming or knowing the violent history of settler occupation. As settlers doing ecopsychology, we may not question how we've come to have access to the land we do. Indeed, just as people living in Indigenous territories. We may not know what the Indigenous people's history and experience of this land is. By both relating to the land as unpeopled and without this violent history, sorry, let me start that again. Both relating to the land as unpeopled and without a violent history is made possible by settler colonial narratives that function both in society and in ecopsychology. Narratives like the doctrine of discovery and terra nullius, which means land belonging to no one. These have justified European sovereignty, and they continue to underpin our social and political institutions in Canada. Also places like the US and Australia and New Zealand. In Canada, the prevailing social narrative of settler people is what Paulette Reagan calls the benevolent peacemaker myth. So this is a myth that has settler people see themselves as the kind and gentle colonizers, sort of the ones helping Indigenous people to become civilized, as it were. This, of course, continues to operate through our social policies and operates through the Indian Act and other paternalistic structures in Canada. So to inquire even just a little bit about the place where we live, where we participate in ecopsychology programs, is to learn about the displacement and dispossession of Indigenous peoples from their territories. This displacement and dispossession has enabled settler ecopsychology practitioners access to the places where we do conduct our practice, and indeed where we live. I can't think of specific examples because everywhere on Turtle Island is a story of Indigenous dispossession. Secondly, in the midst of ongoing colonialism, it's deeply problematic for settler peoples, including ecopsychology practitioners, to become or be Indigenous within colonized spaces in order to gain a sense of belonging. So this is the process of naturalizing settler presence and cultivating this replacement project of settler colonialism. Ecopsychology, as we'd written about in the paper, teaches us that bonding and belonging to place and land are legitimate human needs. They're fundamental to healthy psychological and psychospiritual development. Louise Chalwa notes that our psychological development requires a kind of spreading out on the land, and that our bond to the land as adults gives us a deep sense of security from which to operate from. But in settler colonial culture, this need for belonging to place functions to further displace and replace Indigenous peoples. Settler people have more power and greater access to land, although our psychological development is also inhibited by industrial capitalist colonial culture. Of that, there's no doubt. This, however, functions differently for Indigenous and settler people. Engaging in practices that mirror Indigenous cultural practices in colonized spaces is also extremely problematic. These are practices and programs that I have engaged in for self-healing and that I truly love. They're rites of passage programs, medicine walks, models that mirror the medicine wheel. They're practices and ideas and theories that have brought me a lot of support and learning and healing myself, and they're practices that I've supported others in terms of ecopsychology practice. But to consider that I, as a non-Indigenous white settler ecopsychology practitioner, may have greater access to land than Indigenous people whose territory I'm in, while performing dominant notions of that are like their culture, is extremely problematic to me. Certainly, the ways in which we're practicing are not intended to be culturally appropriating, but in the context of colonization and in the context of colonial spaces, they're majorly problematic, especially when there's not a lot of transparency and naming around them. Hopefully we can talk more about this in the discussion. So Unsettling Ecopsychology really is about learning the history of settlement from Indigenous peoples. It's learning about the ongoingness and the full reality of settler colonialism. It is seeing through to the mythology of settler innocence and the narratives that underpin settler colonialism in our practice. It's seeing the land as a people place, both historically and now. So Unsettling Ecopsychology Practice. I think that ecopsychology practice and ecopsychology thinking has a particularly unique skill set for us in terms of addressing pathways to change, in terms of unsettling, and in terms of supporting Indigenous decolonization and Indigenous resurgence. It's an ecological and a psychological way of being and doing, and these are skills that we absolutely need in terms of our unsettling and supporting decolonization. So each of these, accountability, relationality, solidarity, these are all pieces that have to do with creating relationships and approaching this process from an ecological point of view. So accountability, as I've mentioned, learning about the ongoingness of settler colonialism and the history of settlement from Indigenous peoples is up to us to do, taking accountability for that. Through the learning of this history and the experiences of Indigenous people, we can question the legitimacy of colonization. We can uncover the invisible narratives that underpin our practice and counter the erasure of Indigenous peoples, their histories and their geographies, where we are. How that can look like taking the territorial acknowledgement, making it, and then taking it further, of course, discovering local place names in Indigenous languages, learning about the use of a place by Indigenous people now and historically, and what resurgence projects are occurring in that place now, in a place that we practice. It especially means building relationship that's grounded in place. This is something that Jeff Corntassel, a Salagi or Cherokee scholar here at the University of Victoria, mentions is important for the processes of decolonization and for settler people engaging in supporting decolonization. Building relationships in place. I recently took a training with a woman named Lila June Johnston, who is both Diné and also of European descent. in it, she mentioned, you know, in order to build relationships in place, of course, this is a very slow process, but seeking to find an Indigenous community member or leader who is working for the people, and just asking this simple question, if what at all, in what ways can I help? So this, of course, is not an easy thing to do, and I have had my my clumsy, awkward ways of trying to authentically build relationships where I'm living. You know, this is, for me, this has been complicated by the reality of, you know, being a part of settler culture and being someone who moves around quite a bit. It's not terrifically easy to build long-term relationships with local Indigenous people in an authentic way if I'm moving around and practicing ecopsychology and also living in different territories. So that's been a personal challenge for me. You know, on several occasions in the building or creating of several ecopsychology workshops that I've facilitated, I have had the chance to take the time to connect with local Indigenous community members and build relationships. And that was in the process of months of attending events, Indigenous-led events, of having conversations and of making connection, in order to then ask for their participation in events that I was creating. At the same time, you know, Lila June Johnston says, really, in terms of supporting Indigenous decolonization, it's settler people that need to follow Indigenous-led vision and action, not the other way around. So of course, this is a tricky thing when it comes to looking at our own practice of ecopsychology. Something that we mention in the paper, and the last slide I have that I'll show, you know, what are the creative ways our ecopsychology practice can look like when it really has this strong dimension of supporting Indigenous resurgence, regeneration, resistance, and being in solidarity? It might look very, very different. I've had my clumsy ways of, you know, of acting from a place of tokenizing people as well. And, you know, at the last minute, calling up a band office and asking for permission to hold a workshop in a certain place, or to ask for a cultural liaison person to join me, and had to deal with, you know, the discomfort of the response from people I was connecting with in that nation, and also the confusion of, this is sort of new territory, how to build these relationships, but also the embarrassment of being someone doing it at the last minute and really acting from a place of tokenizing. So it, you know, in the midst of being in this situation of needing to act quickly, and the urgency of working to support justice and countering colonialism and supporting decolonization, as well as, of course, protection of the land and the other than humans, there's a slowness that's required. I'll just read a quote. There's such an urgency in the multitude of crises we face, it can make it hard to remember that, in fact, it's urgency thinking that got us into this trouble in the first place. And our potential success lies in doing deep, slow, intentional work. My experience has been that's certainly true in terms of connecting authentically with local Indigenous people. Then, of course, there's engagements in acts of solidarity with resurgence and resistance. This can look any number of ways. I've had the experience of asking for financial donations within ecopsychology workshops to support local Indigenous resurgence projects, such as in Victoria, there's a project called the Community Toolshed project, which is all about restoring Lekwungen food systems, replanting the camas, and taking out invasive species that outcompete the camas and other local foods in that ecosystem. This is both Indigenous-led and settler-supported project. There are many projects that we can support, and as as Waziatowin said, and as we mentioned in our paper, it might be more appropriate for settler people to ensure that Indigenous people have access to their territories and their ways of being than us actually practicing that ourselves. This, of course, is something that needs a lot of discussion and talking about. And I certainly love to practice eco-depth psychology and imaginal processes of all kinds on the land and to connect with the territory here. But this also needs to be held and considered as fundamental to supporting Indigenous resurgence now. There are lots of amazing projects. I'll just end by mentioning a few of them. Incredible resurgence projects happening right now. There's the Dechinta Bush University for Research and Learning in the Northwest Territories, which is a Dene-led and taught program teaching Dene knowledge, expertise, and place-based learning. This is, people like Glenn Coulthard and Leanne Simpson are involved in this program, and it's only just received the next 5 years of funding, but beyond that doesn't have a secure base of funding. There's projects like the Unistoten Healing Lodge. Those pictures there are of Unistoten people up in their territory. It was established in 2000. There's a blockade camp up in the Unistoten territory seeking to prevent tar sands and natural gas from fracking to be transported through pipelines through that territory. You might be familiar with this, and there are many other examples now of pipeline resistance in Canada and the US. So the Unistoten camp is not just a blockade, but it's also an Indigenous regeneration and resurgence program and project to establish a healing lodge for people to go and heal, for Tsuut'in people to go and practice their culture on the land and heal from the intergenerational trauma of colonization that we're all very, very familiar with. Those are just a few, and there are many more that I could speak about. I think that's the end, yeah.